Hey guys, it's Miss Johnson and I'm here to bring you our notes for Unit 4 Learning Target 3. Today we are going to kick off the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is a formula that we use to solve quadratic equations. So far all we've done to solve quadratic equations is factor them. We would factor them and use that zero product property to set them equal to 0 and then solve from there. But not every equation is factorable, and therefore we would need another method in order to be able to solve them. So another method that we use to solve quadratic equations is the quadratic formula. So here is what the quadratic formula is. Okay, I'm going to read it out loud to you. It looks very long. There's a lot of parts to it. There's a lot of steps that we're going to go through, but here's how it sounds if you read it out loud. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2 times a. Okay, so that's a big long formula there. There are some clever songs that you can sing to memorize this formula, and there's some other things that you can do to help memorize it. But you will have access to the formula when you take your quiz and stuff. You don't have to have it memorized. So here are the steps that we go through in order to solve the quadratic formula. So the first thing that we have to do is identify the a, the b, and the c. We did that when we were factoring as well. So that's something, that a, b, and c is the same thing that we've been looking at. The next thing that we would do is plug them into the formula. Then we would simplify from there and make sure we round our answers to the hundredths place. All right, so you are definitely going to need a calculator for this. If you don't have access to a calculator, one thing that you can download, or the best app I should say that you can download, is called Desmos. This calculator right here, this calculator app on your iPad is really helpful when it comes to solving these quadratic equations, because it will not only solve the quadratic equations, or not only be a calculator to use to solve the quadratic equations, it's also a great way to graph those quadratics so you can see where those solutions actually fall on the coordinate plane. All right, so we are going to try number 1. So in number 1, I have 3x squared minus 7x minus 20 is equal to 0. That's my expression. So the first thing I'm going to do is identify my a, my b, and my c. The a value is 3, the b value is negative 7, and the c value is negative 20. Then after I've identified those, I want to plug them into the quadratic equation, or the quadratic formula. So I'm going to have x equals the opposite of b. B is negative 7, which means the opposite of b is going to be positive 7, plus or minus the square root of negative 7 squared. Notice that I put it in parentheses. Opposite of b minus 4 times 3 times negative 20. That 3 and negative 20 come from the a and the c. So a is 3, c is negative 20. This 4 is always a 4. People get confused by that 4. That 4 is always a 4 in the equation. Then this is all divided by 2 times 3. Notice that my fraction bar even comes all the way over here under the 7. The whole thing is going to be divided by 2 times 3. Okay. All right, so here's what's happening when we try to simplify. So our variables, or our values, are plugged in for the variables in the equation. Now I have to go through and simplify. There's a lot of stuff in the numerator that I have to take care of, okay? A whole lot of things are in the numerator that I have to take care of. In the denominator, all I need to do is multiply 2 times 3. That I can even do in my head. I can just call this 6 if I want to. But I have to go through and I have to take care of everything in the numerator before I can cross the fraction bar and divide by 6. You can't do anything with the division of 6 until the very end. So I'm going to take a look up at the top. the first thing that I need to take care of is all this stuff underneath the radical. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do first. So I'm not doing anything with the 7 on the outside. I haven't done the addition or subtraction yet. I haven't taken the square root yet. But I can do all this stuff underneath. I know that negative 7 squared is going to give me positive 49. Then I have this piece right here. Negative 4 times 3 times negative 20. So first of all, I notice that a negative times a negative is going to give me a positive, which means I'm adding. Then I have 4 times 3, which is 12, and 12 times 20, which is 240. Okay, so I simplified those. I still have the division of 6 in the bottom. Haven't done anything with that yet, okay? Next thing. The next thing that I want to do is I want to put those two pieces together. So I have x equals, still haven't touched the 7. Still haven't done the plus or minus, which we'll come back to that in a second. Now I can add the parts underneath that radical. 49 plus 240 is 289. Still haven't done anything with the division of 6. Okay? All I've done so far is take care of that stuff underneath the radical sign. All right, next, I'm going to come up to this next row over here. Now we need to actually take the square root. So I'm going to go through and take the square root of 289. I end up getting x equals 7 plus or minus 17 divided by 6. I took the square root of 289, which means my radical is now gone. So I don't have the radical anymore, which is good. I'm getting closer. Okay. Now, here's where things get a little tricky. I have two possible solutions to my quadratic. If you think back to factoring, you would end up with two factored parts. You'd have two factors, and you would set each of those two factors equal to 0 and solve from there. So what happens in the quadratic formula is I need to split this piece apart. This literally says plus and minus, which means that I have two forms of this expression. One is adding, 7 plus 17 over 6, and the other is subtracting, 7 minus 17 over 6. So 7 plus 17 over 6, 7 and 17 gives me 24. 24 divided by 6 is 4. So there's one of my solutions. Over here, 7 minus 17 is negative 10. And then the very last thing, negative 10 divided by 6, gives me, it's negative 5/3. We could leave it as a fraction if we just reduce that there. Or you could call it negative 1 2/3 or negative 1.67 if you typed it into your calculator. Any one of those would work. But what I want you to notice is a couple of things here. One, we got two solutions at the end because we split apart that plus and minus into two pieces. Two, the very, very last thing that I did was divide by 6. The very last thing that I did was divide by the 6 in the denominator. I had to take care of all of this stuff up in the numerator before I was allowed to cross the fraction bar and do the division of 6. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps to get through the quadratic formula. It's a lot. There's a lot to think about. But the nice thing about the quadratic formula is that once you learn how to do it, it starts to go really quick and it works every single time. You don't have to worry, is that expression factorable? Am I going to be able to find the factors? How do I solve the x? You don't have to do any of that. All you have to do is plug them in and simplify. All right, let's try the next one. So in the next one, I have an a of 1, a b of 3, and a c of negative 18. So here's my a, here's my b, here's my c. All right, so if I plug this in, it looks like x equals the opposite of b. That's negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 18. All divided by 2 times a, which is 1. All right, so there's my expression that I'm solving. I need to start underneath the radical. I can also take care of this 2 times 1 and just call it 2. But I'm going to start underneath the radical. So I'm not touching the negative 3 outside yet. I haven't done anything with the plus or minus. I haven't even done the radical. But I am going to simplify underneath. 3 squared is 9. Negative 4 times 1 times negative 18. So again, get out your calculator to help you if you need help with that. But basically, you have 4 times 18 here. You know that a negative times a negative is going to give you a positive, and you know that multiplying by 1 doesn't really make a difference. So take 4 times 18 in your calculator. So I get 72 there. I'm still dividing the whole thing by 2. Haven't taken care of that at all. Now I'm going to put those two pieces together. 9 and 72 is 81. So negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 81, all divided by 2. Again, I'm going to come up to the top here and do a second row or a second column. So x equals, now I take the square root of 81. Still haven't touched the negative 3. Still haven't touched the plus or minus. The square root of 81 is 9. So that's helpful. All divided by 2. Okay. So then, now I'm at the point where I've done all the simplifying that I can before I split. So now I'm going to split them apart. X equals negative 3 plus 9 over 2, and x equals negative 3 minus 9 over 2. So then I have x equaling 6 over 2. Negative 3 plus 9 is 6. So that's x equals 3. And x equals negative 12 over 2, or x equals negative 6. There are my two solutions. All right, let's try the next one. So I have a being 4, b being 2, c being negative 17. So when I plug it in, it looks like this. X equals the opposite of b, negative 2. Again, b is positive 2, so the opposite of b would be negative 2. Plus or minus square root of 2 squared, b squared, minus 4 times a, which is 4, times c, which is negative 17. All divided by 2 times a, which is 4. All right, I have to start under the radical. Can't do anything with the negative 2. Can't do anything with the plus or minus yet. I'm going to start under the radical. 2 squared is 4, so that's good. Then I have negative 4 times negative 17. One more time, or once again, we have a negative times a negative, which gives me a positive. And then in your calculator, just type 4 times 17. And I get 272 there. Divided by, in the denominator, you can go ahead and multiply 2 times 4 and get 8. All right, so the next step would be, let's add these two together. So x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 276 divided by 8. All right, so now let's take the square root of 276 in our calculators. So when you take the square root of 276, you get 16.61. It's kind of an awkward number. 276 is not a perfect square. So negative 2 plus or minus 16.61 divided by 8. And then I split them apart. So I'm going to take that plus or minus and I'm going to split them up. So that's x equals, when I split those off, x equals negative 2 plus 16.61 divided by 8. And x equals, sorry, I'm running out of room here, negative 2 minus 16.61 divided by 8. Take that all into your calculator, or type that all into your calculator. So negative 2 plus 16.61, see what that is. I get 14.61. And divide that by 8. I end up with 1.83 after I round it. So there's 1. Then I do the other side. Negative 2 minus 16.61. So So that's going to be negative 18.61 divided by 8. Divide that whole thing by 8, and I get x equals negative 2.33. So there are my two solutions. Now, this is a case where this expression would not have been factorable. The fact that we got something underneath the radical that was not a perfect square, I wouldn't have been able to factor this. So this is one where I would have had to use the quadratic formula in order to solve, okay? But again, the quadratic formula is nice because it always works. You are always going to find an answer when you use the quadratic formula. You don't have to worry about whether it's factorable or not. All right, so let's take a look at number 4. So in number 4, here I'm plugging in I'm identifying my values. My A is 1, my B is negative 5, and my C is 2. So here's my equation. Opposite of B, that's positive 5, plus or minus the square root of negative 5 squared minus 4 times A, which is 1, times C, which is 2. All divided by 2 times A, which is 1. Start under the radical. So I have x equals 5 plus or minus, haven't touched it. Negative 5 squared is positive 25. I want you to be really careful when you type that into your calculator. If you're going to type in negative 5 squared into your calculator, you have to make sure that you put parentheses around it. We all know that when you take a negative times a negative, it becomes a positive number. If you don't put parentheses around it in your calculator will give you negative 25. But we know that a negative times a negative is a positive. So be really careful there. Then I have minus 4 times A times C. That's 4 times 1 times 2, which is 8. So minus 8, all divided by 2. This time it is a minus 8 because there's only one negative there. So then I have 5 plus or minus 25 minus 8 is going to be 17, all divided by 2. So take the square root of 17 in your calculator. So now I need to do this. I'm going to come up to a new row. X equals 5 plus or minus the square root of 17 is 4.12. All divided by the 2 times the 1, which is 2. And now I'm ready to split them. So I'm going to split them apart into 1 plus and 1 minus. 5 plus 4.12 over 2. And 5 minus 4.12 over 2. So then that gives me x equals 9.12 over 2. And 9.12 divided by 2 is 4.56. And then over here, x equals 5 minus 4.12 is 1.12 divided by 2. And 1.12 divided by 2 is 0.56. So there are my two solutions, x equals 4.56 and x equals 0.56. And again, this is one where you had 17 under the radical. 17 is not a perfect square, which is why we got a decimal answer here. Since 17 is not a perfect square, that means we wouldn't have been able to factor this one. All right, we're going to do this 2 more times together today. So A is equal to 1, B is equal to 6, C is equal to 9. So I have x equals, opposite of B, negative 6, plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 9, all over 2 times 1. So we end up, let's do under the radical first. Nothing happens with the negative 6 outside yet. Underneath the radical, 6 squared is 36. 4 times 1 times 9 is also 36. So I have 36 minus 36. What does that do? In the bottom, I can take 2 times 1 and make it 2. So that's good. Now, let's talk about underneath that radical. So I have negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 0. Okay, interesting. If I take the square root of 0 in my calculator, -6 plus or minus, the square root of 0 ends up being 0. So look at what happens when we split these apart. So I have x equals -6 plus 0 over 2, and x equals -6 minus 0 over 2. Well, what happens when you add or subtract 0? The answer is nothing. Nothing changes. So you end up with x equals -6 over 2, which is x equals -3. Then over here, you also get -6 over 2, which is x equals -3. So really, you end up with only one solution here at x equals -3. Okay, so this is a different kind of quadratic where you ended up only having one possible solution. This would have been that factored form where you had x plus 3 times another x plus 3 equaling 0. And when you split that x plus 3 and that x plus 3, you get -3 for both of them. That's what would have happened here if we would have factored this. All right, last one that we're going to do together today. So again, my a value is 1, my b value now is -2, and my c value is -3. So here's what it looks like in the quadratic formula. The opposite of b is +2, plus or minus the square root of -2 squared minus 4 times 1 times -3, all over 2 times 1. Start under the radical. Have to go under there first. So I'm not going to touch the 2 on the outside. Plus or minus stays there for now. -2 squared is +4. Negative times negative is going to give me a plus this time. And 4 times 1 times 3 is 12. In the bottom, 2 times 1 is just 2. I can add those two together. So I still haven't touched the 2 on the outside. Still haven't done the plus or minus. Now I'm looking at the square root of 16, all over 2. All right, so the square root of 16 gives me 4. So I have x equals 2 plus or minus 4 all over 2. And then I can split those apart into x equals 2 plus 4 over 2. And x equals 2 minus 4 over 2. Well, that gives me x equals 6 over 2 and x equals -2 over 2, which is x equals 3 and x equals -1. 2 solutions there. All right, that is our first introduction to the quadratic formula. We are going to spend a few days on this, so if it looked really complicated and tricky today, don't worry, we're not done yet. So just hang in there with us as we go through a few more days and a few more lessons and a lot more practice of what this quadratic formula looks like. Thanks for tuning in today, and I will catch you next time.